Although I experienced something of the Second World War myself as a teenager and a grammar school pupil, I've got no real concept of what the First World War was like except through what my father told me. He joined the army the day after his 19th birthday in 1915 and was sent to France on the 1st of January 1916. Then spent his time in the trenches and in the reserve areas in France until the end of the war in 1918. His role in the war, he was in the engineers in the signals section, and they were the handled all the telephone communications, and at that time they laid wire along the parapet of the trenches, and if they were broken by shell fire, people like my father had to go along, find the break and mend it. And it wasn't the most comfortable thing to be doing, I'm sure, because it meant that because the wire was up on the parapet, you were fairly exposed. And he did this for most of his service there. It must have made an enormous impression on him. He experienced many of the horrors, although he was in the signals. He witnessed so much carnage that it's almost impossible to imagine. But like many of the veterans, he did not talk about it until very late in his life. It was something they buried so they could live with it. He witnessed the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and it made an enormous impression on him. To the end of his life, he could not really talk about it without breaking down in tears. In the late 1980s, he was in hospital in Cambridge, and over the Armistice Day weekend, and the hospital chaplain asked him if he would read one of the lessons, and he refused. It wasn't that public speaking was difficult for him. He was a teacher. He was also a lay preacher. But he was just afraid he would break down and couldn't do it. For my father, Remembrance Day was of enormous importance. He remembered not only the many, many people who lost their lives, he remembered it as something which should never be repeated.
I was around during World War II, and I have some childhood recollections of the conflict that went on. My brother and sister were both older than I was when the war began, and my brother lied about his age to join the Royal Navy. My sister desperately wanted to join the ATS, but because she was a skilled seamstress, she wasn't allowed to do so until late in the war. The last bomb that fell on Liverpool hit St Margaret's Church, about 200 or 300 yards away from where we lived. The air raid warning siren was late that night, and the bombs were already falling when we made our way into the air raid shelter in our backyard. There was also an outside toilet in the backyard, and it was my mother's habit to spend a penny before she went into the air raid shelter because she didn't know how long they would be in there. And for some reason, that night she didn't go in. Seconds after we got into the air raid shelter, a piece of masonry from the explosion at the church destroyed our backyard wall and filled the toilet with bricks that would certainly have killed her. So luck played a big part in people's lives every day during World War II. As I lived in Liverpool, I saw firsthand what the damage that the Luftwaffe could do, and they really at times weren't very good. They missed their prime targets, and often hit residential areas and did a lot of damage and killed a lot of people. The impact on Penketh and Sankey may not have been a physical one, but in terms of family lives and people whose lives were lost during the war, and both wars in fact, they should also be remembered and respected. And the rededication of the memorial in St Mary's Churchyard recently bears testament to that, and we shouldn't forget the sacrifices that people made in both world wars.
People those days didn't have telephones. You couldn't telephone with your relatives or your friends. And as I say, when I came back from the Middle East, we had to send telegrams. And that was the only way that we could tell them. Or we had to send a letter to say what was happening. We could only tell them so much. We couldn't tell them everything where we were. In fact, now that I recollect, we were on the ship. It was the troop ship that I was on was called the Empress of Canada. It was taken over as a troop ship, and when we were in mid-Atlantic, a lot of propaganda was going on from both sides, from the Germans and the English and the Americans. And there was a man called William Joyce. He was an Irishman, but he was nicknamed by the British public Lord Haw-Haw. And he turned over to the Germans. He was speaking for the Germans, and that's what we called him. And he was a traitor. Eventually he got hung for being a traitor, but he said on the radio that he'd sunk the Empress of Canada with all the troops on board. But we were still on the high sea. We were still in the convoy. So we all had a good laugh. But on second thoughts, we thought, well, it's a good job our relatives don't know we're on the Empress of Canada, because they would have thought we'd all been drowned. When the invasion started in June, to say that you weren't afraid, it wasn't true. You were apprehensive, you were scared, you didn't know whether you were going to get there, whether you were going to be hit by submarines crossing the channel or bombed by the aircraft coming over. All that was an experience that you wouldn't like to go through again. It brought back quite a lot of sad memories, especially when I went back to Normandy with my son Colin to see the beach where I'd landed. The first time I went back was 65 years after the landing, and it did fill you with emotion to see the place where you landed on the beach, and you wondered at the time what happened to your pals that were with you during the invasion. Well, I think it's important for the future generation to remember what sacrifices their forebears did during the First and Second World War, not just the Second War that I was involved in, the First World War which my father was involved in. And I think it is important that the future generation should remember and know and perhaps speak to people while they can of what happened during the wars.
So did you make any lifelong friendships during your time in the war?
Yes, in fact I did. I arranged a couple of reunions in Warrington at the White Hart Hotel in the centre of town, and we got lads from South Wales, Devon, and quite a lot of our lads came from Liverpool, and we had about, at the first reunion we had about 80, so we had a good turnout. The next one was about 60, but we did keep in touch with quite a lot of my pals. There was one lad from Liverpool, married a girl in Totnes in Devon, and we used to correspond and go to see one another occasionally. He'd come and stay here in Penketh, and we'd go down to Devon, stay for a while with him. And my other pal from Anfield in Liverpool, he married a girl when we were in Belgium, and he stayed in Belgium, and eventually he picked the trade up from his father-in-law, became the village baker. So that was quite a contrast from living in Liverpool. But he settled there and he lived there all his life. He died about 4 years ago. So yes, we did keep in touch.
So how did the war change you as a person?
Well, I came from a humble background. I didn't travel any distance. If we had a day out to New Brighton, Liverpool, that was something in our lives. People had no money, and you couldn't travel the distances that you can travel today. So with me being in the forces, it was an experience to see the different cultures in the Middle East. In Europe, in France, Normandy, places like that, the culture there was similar to ours, but it was totally different in Africa, where you had the different religions, different cultures, and it was very interesting to see how they lived.
How did you cope with being away from your loved ones for such a long period of time?
Well, we looked forward to the mail. That was important, and fortunately my wife did write quite often to me, and we did get the occasional parcel. And also the military in Cairo did produce a magazine or a newsletter which was distributed to the various areas in the Middle East, and we used to look forward to that news, and that did keep you going, yeah.
It affects me because I've experienced my father's distress talking about it, and it must have been absolute hell to be there, and I use that word very specifically as hell, because it was so, the carnage was enormous, the losses were enormous, and it went on for months.
To me, Remembrance Sunday is a time when to respect and remember that everyone who played their parts in defeating the Nazis. Not armed services certainly, but also people like firemen, nurses, merchant seamen. Merchant seamen lost 30,000 sailors during the war. That's comparable with any of the armed services. And it's a time to remember all the people whose countries and lives were destroyed by it on both sides.
I think it's important because it helps us to realise the lengths that people went to back in 1914 and 1939 in order for the people today to have the freedom that they have now.
I think Remembrance Day is important because it helps young people to understand the events that took place and why we should have the high amount of respect that we do have for the soldiers.
I think it's very important because it was a very significant event that occurred, and it's an event that we shouldn't ever forget because it had a massive impact on everyone.
Remembrance Day is important because we need to realise that people put their lives on the line just so we could have our freedom.
I have accompanied him to a Remembrance Day service at the War Memorial in the little town of Saffron Walden where he lived. And I have stood there beside him, and he had tears streaming down his face during the 2 minutes silence. And I think we should remember, all of us, remember and continue to remember the futility of war as a way of solving disputes.